Life of David Livingston, Part 34. Despite the apparent difficulty about the altitude, there is another strong reason for believing Webb's River or the Lualaba to be the Nile. The watershed of this river, 600 miles of which Livingston has traveled, is drained by a valley which lies north and south between the eastern and western ranges of the watershed. This valley, or line of drainage, while it does not receive the Kasai and the Kwango, receives rivers flowing from a great distance west, for instance, the important tributaries Lufira and Lamami, and large rivers from the east, such as the Lindi and Luamo. And while the most intelligent Portuguese travelers and traders state that the Kasai and the Kwango and Lubelash are the headwaters of the Congo River, no one has yet stated the supposition that the Grand River flowing north and known to the natives as the Lualaba was the Congo. If this river is not the Nile, where then are the headwaters of the Nile? The small river running out of the Victoria Nyanza and the river flowing out of the little lake Albert have not sufficient water to form the great river of Egypt. As you glide down the Nile and note the Asna, the Giraffe, the Sabat, the Blue Nile, and Atbara, and follow the river down to Egypt, it cannot fail to impress you that it requires many more streams, or one large river, rather larger than all yet discovered, to influence its inundations and replace the waste of its flow through the 1,000 miles of desert. Perhaps a more critical survey of the Bar Ghazal would prove that the Nile is influenced by the waters that pour through the small piece of water resembling a duck pond buried in a sea of rushes, as Speck describes the Bar Ghazal. Livingston's discovery answers the question and satisfies the intelligent hundreds who, though Bruce and Speck and Baker each in his own turn has declared he has found the Nile, the only and true Nile sources, yet doubted and hesitated to accept the enthusiastic assertions as a final solution of the Nile problem. Even yet, according to Livingston, the Nile sources have not been found, though he has traced the Lualaba through 7 degrees of latitude, flowing north, and though neither he nor I have a particle of doubt of its being the Nile, not yet can the Nile question be said to be ended for 3 reasons. First, he has heard of the existence of 4 fountains, 2 of which gave birth to a river flowing north. Webb's River, or the Lualaba, to a river flowing south, which is the Zambezi. He has heard of these fountains repeatedly from the natives. Several times he has been within 100 and 200 miles from them, but something always interposed to prevent him going to see them. According to those who have seen them, they rise on either side of the mound or hill which contains no stones. Some have even called it an ant hill. One of these fountains is said to be large, so large that a man standing on one side can't be seen from the other. These fountains must be discovered and their position taken. The doctor does not suppose them to lie south of the feeders of Lake Bangweolo. Second, Webb's River must be traced to its connection with some portion of the old Nile. Third, the connection between the Tanganyika and the Albert Nyanza must be ascertained. When these 3 things have been accomplished, then and not till then can the mystery of the Nile be explained. The 2 countries through which the marvelous lacustrine, the Lulalaba flows with its multifold lakes and broad expanses of water are Rua, the Urawa of Speke, and Manyeme. For the first time, Europe is made aware that between the Tanganyika and the known sources of the Congo, there exist teeming millions of the Negro race who never saw or heard of white peoples who make such noisy and busy stir outside of Africa upon the minds of those who had who had the good fortune to see the first specimen of these remarkable white races. Livingston seems to have made a favorable impression, though through misunderstanding his object and coupling him with the Arabs who make horrible work there, his life has been sought after more than once. These two extensive countries, Rua and Manyema, are populated by true heathens, governed not by the sovereignties of sovereignties sovereignties of Karagwa, Wamdi, and Uganda by despotic kings, but each village by its own sultan or lord. 30 miles outside of their own immediate settlements, the most intelligent of those small chiefs seem to know nothing. 30 miles from the Luaba, Lulaba, there were but few people who had ever heard of the great river. Such ignorance among the natives of their own countries, of course, increased the labors of Livingston. Compared with these, all tribes and nations of Africa with whom Livingston came to contact may be deemed civilized. Yet, in the arts of home manufacture, these wild people of Manyema are far superior to any he had seen. When other tribes and nations contented themselves with hides and skins of animals thrown negligently over their shoulders, the people of Manyema manufactured a cloth from fine grass which may favorably compare with the finest grass cloth of India. They also know the art of dyeing in various colors, black, yellow, and purple. The Wangwana, or freemen of Zanzibar, struck with the beauty of this fine grass fabric, eagerly exchanged their cotton clothes for fine grass cloth, and on almost every black man returned from Manyema I have seen this native cloth converted into elegantly made short jackets. These countries are also very rich in ivory. The fever for going to Manyema to exchange their tawdry beads for the precious tusks of Manyema is the same kind of that impelled men to the gulches and placers of California, Colorado, Montana, and Idaho, after nuggets to Australia and diamonds to Cape Colony. Manyema is at present the El Dorado of the Arabs, and the Wamria, Wamrima tribes is only about 4 years since the first Arab returned from Manyema with such wealth of ivory and reports about the fabulous quantities found there. They talk about it like it's being dug up from the ground. They're cutting it off the faces of elephants and rhinos, but whatever. That ever since the old beaten tracks of Karagwa, Uganda, Upfa, and Marungu have been comparatively deserted, the people of Manyema, ignorant of the value of the precious article, reared their huts upon ivory stanchions. Ivory pillars and doors were common sights in Manyema, and hearing of these, one can no longer wonder at the ivory palace of Solomon. For generations they had used ivory tusks as doorposts and eve stanchions, until they had become perfectly rotten and worthless. But the advent of the Arabs soon taught them the value of the article. It is now risen considerably in price, though yet fabulously cheap. At Zanzibar, the value of ivory per farashilah of 35 pounds weight is from $50 to $60. According to its quantity in Uyembe, it is about $1.10 a pound. But in Manyama, Manyama, it may be purchased for from half a cent to 1.25 cents worth of copper per pound of ivory. The Arabs, however, have a knack of spoiling markets by their rapacity and wanton cruelty. With muskets, a small party of Arabs are invincible against such people as those of Minyama, who until lately have never heard the sound of a gun, and the report of a musket inspires mortal terror in them, and it is almost impossible to induce them to face the muzzle of a gun. They believe that the Arabs have stolen the lightning, and that against such people the bow and arrow can have but little effect. They are by no means devoid of courage, and they have often declared that they were not that were it not for the guns, not one Arab would leave the country alive, which tends to prove that they would willingly engage in fight with the strangers who had made themselves so detestable, were it not for that the startling explosion of gunpowder inspires them with such terror. Into whichever country the Arabs enter, they contrive to render their name and race abominated. But the mainspring of it all is not the Arab's nature, color, or name, but simply the slave trade. So long as the slave trade is permitted to be kept up at Zanzibar, so long will these otherwise enterprising people, the Arabs, kindle against them throughout Africa the hatred of the natives. The accounts which the doctor brings from that new region are most deplorable. He was an unwilling spectator of a horrible deed, a massacre committed on the inhabitants of a populous district, who had assembled in the marketplace on the banks of the Lualaba, as they became accustomed for all the ages. It seems the Wamanyema were very fond of marketing, believing it to be the summum bonum of human enjoyment. They find unceasing pleasure in chaffering with might and main for the least mite of their currency, the least bead, and when they gain the point to which their particular talents are devoted, they feel intensely happy. The women are excessively fond of their marketing, and as they are very beautiful, the marketplace must possess considerable attractions for the male sex. It was on such a day that, with just such a scene, that Tagamoyo, a half caste Arab, with his armed slave escort, commenced an indiscriminate massacre with firing volley after volley into the dense mass of human beings. It is supposed that there were about 2,000 people there, and at the first sound of the firing, these poor people all made a rush for the canoes. In the fearful hurry to avoid being shot, the canoes were paddled away by the first fortunate few who got possession of them, and those that were not so fortunate sprang into the deep waters of the Lualaba. And though many of them became an easy prey to the very ferocious crocodiles that swarmed to the scene, the majority received their deaths from the bullets of the merciless Tagamoyo and his villainous band. The doctor believes that, as do the Arabs themselves, that about 400 people, mostly women and children, lost their lives, while many more were made slaves. This scene is only one of many such which he has unwillingly witnessed, and he is utterly unable to describe the loathing he feels for the inhumane perpetrators. Slaves from Manyema command a higher price than those of any other country because of their fine forms and general docility. The women, the doctor says, repeatedly are remarkably pretty creatures and have nothing except their hair in common with the Negroes of the West Coast. They are of very light color. They have fine noses, well cut, and not over full lips. Tick. And a prognathous jaw is uncommon. These women are eagerly sought after for wives by the half castes of the East Coast, and even more pure Amani Arabs do not disdain connection with them. To the north of Menyema, Livingston came to a light complexioned race of the color of Portuguese, or our own Louisiana quadroons, who are very fine people and singularly remarkable for commercial cuteness and sage, sagacity. The women are expert divers for oysters, which are found in great abundance in the Lualaba. Rua, at the place called Katanga, is rich in copper, and copper mines of this place have been worked for ages. In the bed of the stream, gold has been found, washed down in pencil shaped lumps or particles as large as split peas. 2 Arabs have gone thither to prospect for this metal, but as they are ignorant of the art of gulch mining, it is scarcely possible that they will succeed. From these highly important and interesting discoveries, Dr. Livingston has turned back when almost on the threshold of success by the positive refusal of his men to accompany him further. They were afraid to go unless accompanied by a large force of men, and as these were not procurable in Manyema, the doctor reluctantly turned his face towards Ujiji. It was a long and weary road back. The journey had now no interest for him. He had traveled it before, when going westward, full of high hopes and aspirations, impatient to reach the goal which promised him rest from his labors. Now, returning unsuccessful, baffled and thwarted, when almost in sight of the end, and having to travel the same road back on foot with disappointed expectations and defeated hopes preying on his mind, no wonder that the brave old spirit almost succumbed and the strong constitution almost wrecked. He arrived at Ujiji October 26, almost at death's door. On the way, he had been trying to cheer himself up, since he had found it impossible to contend against the obstinacy of his men. With it won't take long, 5 or 6 months more, it matters not, since it can't be helped. I have got my goods in Ujiji. I can hire other people and make a new start. These are the words and hopes with which he tried to delude himself into the idea that all would be right. But imagine, if you can, the shock he must have suffered when he found that the man to whom he had entrusted his goods for safe keeping had sold every bale for ivory. See that? Those 2 paragraphs I read just fine because there was no like tough words, like these weird. It's not even African words. Half of it is. The other half of it isn't place names. It's like Victorian English words we don't use anymore. Like whatever word he had for the covering over the front door of a hut that they were using ivory for. Some kind of word for awning. Never heard it before. Anyway, the evening of the day Livingston returned to Ujiji, Susi and Shuma, 2 of his most faithful men, were seen crying bitterly. The doctor asked them what ailed them, and was then informed for the first time of the evil tidings that awaited him. Said they, all our things are sold, sir. Sharif has sold everything for ivory. Later in the evening, Sharif came to see him and shamelessly offered his hand. With a salutary Yambo, Livingston refused his hand, saying he could not shake hands with a thief. As an excuse, Sharif said he had he had divined on the Quran, and that he told him the doctor was dead. Livingston was now destitute. He had just enough to keep him and his men alive for about a month, after which he would be forced to beg from the Arabs. He had arrived in Ujiji October 26. The Herald expedition arrived November 10 from the coast, only 16 days difference. Had I not been delayed at Yiniyamembe by the war with Miriambo, I should have gone on to Manyema and very likely have been traveling by one road, while he would have been coming by another to Ujiji. Had I gone on 2 years ago, when I first received the instructions, I should have lost him without doubt. But I am detained by a series of circumstances which chafed and fretted me considerably at the time, only to permit him to reach Ujiji 16 days before I appeared. It was as if we were marching to meet together at an appointed rendezvous, the one from the west, the other from the east. The doctor had heard of a white man being at Uyembembe, but who had said to have boots there's no word well. Why did I insert the word well? Who was said to have boats with him, the French government to replace Lieutenant Lisante, who died from a fever a few miles above Gondokoro. I had not written to him because I believed him to be dead, and of course my sudden entrance into Ujiji was as great a surprise to him as it was to the Arabs. But the sight of the American flag, which he saw waving in the van of the expedition, indicated that one was coming who could speak his own language, and you all know already how the leader was received. End of chapter 13.